indifference curves and their slopes. But what is an indifference curve? In the most simple language, indifference curve is locus of all points that give the individual same level of satisfaction or same level of utility. Let us try to consider this diagram here. Note that on point A, consumer is consuming less of good X and more of good Y. Consider that on point B, consumer is consuming more of good X and less of good Y. So the 2 points have different levels of consumptions of good X and good Y. However, if I say that they lie on the same IC, it means that the consumer gets the same level of satisfaction from bundle A and bundle B. It means that the utility of consumer from bundle A should be equal to the utility of consumer from bundle B. So A and B should give consumer the same level of satisfaction. But this is not the only shape of IC. IC can be linear, as we will see in the coming videos. IC can be L-shaped. IC can be of any shape possible. So it is not necessary that ICs have to be convex like I have shown here in this diagram. But these convex ICs, they are called as well-defined indifference curves. They are called as well-defined indifference curves. There are certain properties of these ICs, and the most important one is that they have a negative and diminishing slope. Let us try to understand why. Note that when I talk about point A here, slope is tangent line. So slope is this. Slope will be this. Something like this. And at point B, slope will be like this, flatter. And at C, maybe slope will be very flat. So note that as we go from point A to B to C, the slope is becoming from steeper to flatter. This is what we go ahead and we see. Now, think about what this slope means. At any point of time, the slope is perpendicular by base. So it tells me the change in perpendicular by base. Perpendicular by base. This is what the slope tells me. So if I have good Y here and I have good X here, so the slope here tells me what is the change in good Y by change in good X. And the slope here also tells me what is the change in good Y by change in good X. Note that at point A, I have a huge amount of good Y, huge amount of good Y. When the consumer has a huge amount of good Y, he is willing to give up more of good Y because he has a lot of Y for an additional unit of good X. So he values good X more. He values good X more at this point because he has very less good X. He has too much of good Y. So he is willing to give up an additional unit of, for an additional unit of good X, too much of good Y. He can give up too much of good Y. So let's say that, suppose this is 5. So I'm willing to give up 5 units of good Y for 1 unit of good X. This is my MRS. This is the slope of IC, which is called MRS, marginal rate of substitution. But now let's talk about point B. At point B, the consumer is only willing to give up very less good Y for an additional unit of good X. And the reason is that he is left up with very less of good Y. So he cannot give too much of good Y. He is willing to give up very less of good Y for an additional unit of good X. right? So he has started valuing good Y more because he has less of good Y. So the MRS diminishes. The amount of Y I am willing to give up for an additional unit of good X falls. So there must be some compensation that you must give up of good Y to get more units of good X. At point A, you are willing to give up more of good Y for an additional unit of good X. At B, you are willing to give up less of good Y for an additional unit of good X. MRS in the most simple terms is marginal rate of substitution. It basically tells us how much of good Y you're willing to give up for an additional unit of good X. At A, again, let's read it out. At A, he's willing to trade huge amount of good Y for an additional unit of X. At B, he's willing to give up less amount of good Y for an additional unit of good X. So as you move from A to B, MRS diminishes. So this is the reason why, what are indifference curves? And at the same time, we also read about what is MRS and why MRS diminishes. Okay, beta. Thank you.